Somewhere out in this location here, General Lee and General Jackson plotted to destroy the Union Army, which lays directly off to my left about 1 mile. General Stewart had found that the right flank of the Union Army laid unprotected, and he came back and reported it. With that information and what Jackson already knew, Jackson devised a plan to attack that flank by splitting the army in half. He proposed the bold plan, and Lee listened intently. Now, any good commander in the face of the enemy, 130,000 strong, over double what you have, listening to such a plan may have said, no way, that's not going to work and we need to go now, we need to leave. But he had faith in the leadership that was in front of him, and he decided to go ahead and allow that plan to go forward. So May 1st, 1863, the two generals bivouacked here and talked about that. And with the help of some of the local citizens and General Stewart, they were able to come up with a plan that was so bold, and yet it ended up working. And although it didn't destroy the Union Army, it made an impossible thing possible. And the Union Army retreated back across the river. For 3 days in May of 1863, General Joseph Hooker ended up making this location over here his headquarters. It was a big, beautiful house out here at this intersection, and everybody knew about this place. It's one of the more popular spots. This house eventually would be overrun by Confederate soldiers as they were on their way to victory and running General Joseph Hooker and his army out of this location. Somewhere out here, eventually a shell would explode overhead also, and historians think that the general was concussed, and it led to some of the disorientation and the confusion that he had near the later part of the battle. Now we're out at the site for the Chancellor's house, the foundation of the Chancellor's house. And for a little bit of orientation here, we're looking at the Orange Plank Road and the Turnpike Road coming up in this direction. Now, on May 1st, that's where Union would have been pushed back through coming up in this direction here. And this is where we're setting up shop if you're General Hooker. Today, this is all that's left of the Chancellor House. May 3rd, shells opened up on this place and caused a fire. And the big, beautiful house just started burning and burning quickly. The ladies that lived inside this house had to rapidly flee. Eventually, all that was left was brick and mortar. And the Chancellor House was a shell of what it used to be. So for some more battlefield orientation, May 2nd, May 3rd, 1863. I'm at the site of Hooker's camp. This is where he set up shop, at the intersection here where the Chancellor's house was. And you're gonna have to work with me here and imagine this. We're talking a U-shaped line. The men are, Union soldiers are in a U shape here, working their way around front, back across this direction here, out into the wooded area, and back here. Now, with that U shape, they've kind of come back on themselves a little bit to protect the lines, because remember, they were surprised on their flank. So the flank is collapsed, and now you have the one line rolling back on the other. You have Anderson and McLaws pressing from this direction here. And then you have Stewart, eventually, who took over for Jackson, pressing from this direction over here. And that pretty much sums it up for May 3rd. Directly out there in front of me is a marker for Lee and Jackson's bivouac. Now, on May 2nd, about 7 a.m., it was about that time before his troops started to pass this part of the journey, and Jackson rode at the head of the column, and his face was flush as he was going down the Orange Plank Road, and he passed this point here. He rode past and he met with Lee and A.P. Hill and Jeb Stuart, and the informal council lasted but just a few minutes, and then Jackson pointed toward the head of his moving column and galloped off. Consequently, it would be the last time that Lee and Jackson would ever meet and ever speak together, before he had to have his arm amputated and then die suddenly of pneumonia just a few days later. I'm out here near the site of the Maury House. He was commander and an oceanographer for the United States Navy. But I'm not here to talk about him and his birthplace. I'm here to talk about General Jackson and the column that moved past here on May 2nd, 1863. At about 10 a.m., Jackson and his columns came down this road. They were about 4 abreast. And as they were passing through here, there was a small clearing in the trees. Union artillerists were able to spot them. They let the commanders know that something was up. At that point, the Union knew that there was movement over here and something was going down. So they started firing artillery pieces out here, and it's about a mile away that they were firing from. The artillery pieces did little to stop or slow or do anything to Jackson's columns, and he continued on towards Catherine Furnace. We'll be headed out that way here in just a few moments. Directly behind me here is the Catherine Furnace, or what remains of it. Now, Catherine Furnace would have had several buildings here leading up to the actual stack itself. And in 1837, this place was created. About a decade later, it shut down. But during the war, it was reborn and turned into a place to create more iron for the Confederacy. Coincidentally, General Custer came out this way and destroyed this place. And eventually it was rebuilt, retooled again for the Confederacy, and operated up until the end of the war. So on May 2nd, Jackson's column started making the way past the Catherine Furnace here, and they were marching down towards the Orange Plank Road. And as we said earlier, there was an opening in the area where artillerists were able to spot the plank, or the columns, as they were going down that way. Jackson's men were strung out for almost 10 miles. By 3 p.m., when they had finally reached their destination, there were still men back here in this location, all the way back in this location here at the roads behind me. The 23rd Georgia eventually ended up being some of the lost casualties out here at this location when they were first spotted. But that surprise attack did work. And even though it wasn't quite a surprise, because they were spotted, and there were reports given to the other officers, including Hooker himself, to let him know that there was some movement over here and something was happening, it worked. And when Jackson come pouring out of that field next to that flank, it practically rolled the army up on itself. And it helped to create a situation that would turn into be one of the greatest victories of the Confederate Army. Today's conveniences have afforded us paved roads, places that we can drive down and not have to worry about sinking our vehicles into when it rains. In those days, dirt roads, that was the way to travel. These roads out here that Jackson was traveling on May 2nd, 1863, were all dirt roads. And early in the morning, a rain had started to fall and moisten the ground. And as Jackson's men were traveling, it softened the blow of the feet on the ground, so the sound was stunted. You couldn't really hear the movement that was happening. But then as the day progressed on and things warmed up, the dirt out here became loose. And as those thousands and thousands of soldiers were tramping on dirt roads, they were kicking up a big dust pile that went above the trees out here. And for miles off, you could actually see the movement that was happening just basically by looking at the dirt. Oftentimes, those flag officers that were standing out trying to find where columns were, they would be looking for things like that. But for some reason, these signs were ignored. And even some of the reports that were given of spotting Confederate soldiers moving was ignored too. Hooker thought he knew Lee. He thought he had it all figured out. And on May 2nd, he found out otherwise. If you're Slocum sitting out here in this position, where I'm at right now, on May 1st and May 2nd, you feel pretty good about where you're at. Off in this direction here, you can kind of see some trenches that are still present today. And they run along this road. The men are sitting here in behind these trenches. Now, he doesn't know it, but the battle's kind of turned for the worse for them. Way back off in this direction over here, that flank got turned on May 2nd like we were talking about. And Stewart is now in charge on May 3rd. And as he's sitting across the way over there, he's sending shells into this direction, and they're coming into the rear of Slocum's line. Havoc and destruction everywhere. And to his front, the enemy. The enemy's coming towards the front as well. So if you're a soldier or an officer sitting in this position, you feel like you are surrounded on all sides. So what's the natural thing to do when you feel like the end is imminent? Death is coming. Do you sit here and take it? Or do you get up and run? I'm now at the site of Jackson's charge on May 2nd, 1863. And I'm going to give you a little bit of battlefield orientation so you'll understand what this was all about. So the position that I'm in right now, you would have seen Union soldiers along this turnpike here and coming back towards me here in just a short line across this field. But they're down this turnpike, and as they go down the turnpike, there's just a small gap in between them, off in that direction there. And then they come back across where the Chancellor House is, and then back towards this direction, way off in the distance. Now, why is this charge over here so successful? Why is it important? Well, General Jackson is coming from this direction, and he passed the Catherine Furnace, and he went down that dirt road that was just behind me in the last segment that we showed you. And as he's setting up over here in this tangled brush, his men are finding it hard to get through it, but they're still staying together, and he's setting up a charge across these fields. May 2nd, 1863. The section right behind me here is a densely wooded area. General Jackson is out there, and he's got his men in those woods. They're formed up in 3 battle lines, and they're stretching from this direction across this direction towards the turnpike right over here. So they're stretching across this way. And as they're coming to the lines this way, they're actually forcing turkeys and deer and all types of animals out ahead of them. These animals are scared, and they're trying to get away from the people. Out in these fields in front of me here, there's Union soldiers that are camped out along this turnpike, and they have their camp stretched all the way out. Some people are out here cooking their dinners, and they're getting prepared for the assaults that are coming that they know are about to happen. Well, these animals come bounding through these camps. The Union soldiers think it curious. They start laughing. Some of them are starting to worry just a little bit. Why are all these animals running towards us? And then it happens. Jackson tells his men to complete the task and go forward. And with those words, the rebel yell rings out across these hills, and they start pouring in and forming battle lines and firing at the men in this direction behind me here. And that is what folds up this flank. It was arguably the most successful assault General Jackson had in his entire career. And it helped General Lee have the most successful victory in his entire career. Unfortunately for these Union soldiers over here, they were caught off guard completely by surprise, and a lot of men lost their lives. A lot of United States soldiers died out here on these fields thanks to that surprise. And then later on that evening, General Jackson is cut down by his own men, the 18th North Carolina. They shot him by mistake, thinking that he was the enemy. But this assault here collapses the line for the Union soldiers, pins them back on each other. They end up having to peel back, create that U shape that we were talking about. And by May 6th, they're already going across the river and vacating the area. And Chancellorsville belongs to Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army. Now, stretched out along that turnpike in exactly the wrong direction was Oliver Otis Howard and his 11th Corps. His line extended for more than a mile along the Orange Plank Road and the turnpike. The Union soldiers ended up facing south, and the 11th Corps was relatively new to the Army of the Potomac. It had about 11,000 men in it and included a large percentage of European immigrants. Some of the names that you might recognize are Bushbeck, Schurz, and even Schimmelpfennig. Schimmelpfennig is famous for Gettysburg. Union pickets warned Howard of the enemy's approach, but he ignored their reports. Army headquarters had assured him that the Confederate Army was in retreat, so he believed them. But now as the Southerners bore down upon Howard's flank, the men of his corps broke and they ran, essentially. From that day on, the 11th Corps would be known as the Flying Dutchman. It was a term that they carried with them throughout the entire war, and Howard and the 11th would spend the entire war trying to earn back their honor after a situation like this. Now that evening, on the 2nd, the fighting started to subside, and the Confederates were stretched out on this field here. And about a half a mile in front of me, there's a church off in the distance. And at the church, the Confederates reformed their lines, got their men together, and planned for the next day. That's where fate would take place, because Jackson would decide that he was going to go and press further out and try to see if there was another way to press the fight for the next day and see if they could catch them off guard again. But like I said, fate was waiting on Jackson, and that evening Jackson would be wounded severely, and a little over a week later would die of pneumonia. Now, it's kind of hard to imagine, but put yourself in the shoes of those soldiers. You're with that 11th Corps, Howard's Corps, and you're stretched out here on these fields, and you're sitting around camp waiting for orders. And the Confederate Army just bears down on you out of nowhere. Disorganization, chaos, your men start running. You're an officer, you're trying to get them back together. It's not working. They're running for their lives. And you're out here on this field trying to figure out how you're going to get your men to stick. How are we going to get this back together? That's exactly what they were faced with out here. And the death and destruction that took place here on this field is unimaginable. The men that died here, the men that were wounded here, the sounds, I don't think there's a way for you to understand it. Out here at Chancellorsville, there is a monument that marks Elijah Franklin Paxton's location of where he may have been killed. Early on in the war, Paxton was picked to command the Stonewall Brigade by Jackson over many more qualified men. It was because he had the confidence in him. But before the battle, Paxton foreshadowed his own death, and he wrote, "The future is dark enough. Though sound in health and strength, I feel that life to many of us hangs upon a slender thread. Whenever God wills it, that mine pass from me, I feel that I can say in calm resignation, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And now, darling, goodbye." If that's not calling your own death, I don't know what is. And he wrote that just before the battle here. So it's stories like that that bring the realness to life of this. It brings how serious this is to you, and it happened on both sides. It's not just one side or the other. These were real people out here. Life and death hung in the balance, and their families were waiting back home, hoping that they would come back to them. And for Mr. Elijah Franklin Paxton, he never returned home, and he was brought back to be buried. Now, the trail that I'm walking on now is part of the National Park Trail here at Chancellorsville. I'm going down to roughly where General Jackson would have been caught in between lines, heading back towards his own lines on the mountain road on the evening of the 2nd of May, 1863. Jackson was out on reconnaissance, and as he was headed down that way, they come back across this line, and Confederates spot him from 18th North Carolina. And they start shooting. The Confederate officer yells, "Cease fire. You are shooting at your own men." One soldier yells, "It's a lie. Pour it into them, boys." And the whole line erupts. And the nighttime illuminates with fire from muskets. Jackson takes wounds to the hand and the left arm. He has his left arm amputated, and 8 days later, Jackson ends up dying. They assume it was probably because of pneumonia that had set in after his injury. And it was a disaster for the Confederacy here at this place on May 2nd. And that would be the end of the second day at Chancellorsville. It was the exclamation point to what was looking like a overwhelming victory at the time, but then stalled out, and May 3rd comes around, and the victory is complete, but not nearly as complete as it could have been. So headed down the direction I'm headed right now, General Jackson was headed towards the Union soldiers, and he could hear the pickaxes from their lines. One of his own staff officers was telling him, "General, it's dangerous. We need to head back." And Jackson yells at him, "The danger's over. They're on the run. Go tell AP Hill to press on the right." Eventually, sometime around 9 p.m. that night, Jackson does make his way back. And as he's headed up in this direction here, towards Bullock Road, that's when the line opens up. And he ends up being wounded. And that spells the end for General Jackson, leading up to the victory at Chancellorsville and the campaign to Gettysburg. Now what you're seeing in front here is one of the earliest known monuments or markers to Jackson's wounding here along the turnpike. The effort to erect a monument at the site of his wounding began in February of 1887, when the newspaper editor Rufus Merchant founded the Stonewall Jackson Merchant Association. On June 13, 1888, ceremonies at the monument had about 5,000 spectators to dedicate it. Guests included the Confederate Cavalry General and Governor Fitzhugh Lee. The rock is still here today, and there's an actual monument that was put in place too. In the location I'm at right now, Lane's men would have been, and the North Carolinians, along with Jackson's men, who would have been all out in the woods and fields behind me here. May 2nd, the nighttime fell, and what wasn't typical was fighting out here, or fighting anywhere on the Civil War battlefield at nighttime. But when darkness descended upon this area, Birney's men decided that they were going to push up to this area and try to reach Plank Road and the turnpike, and then attack the Confederates and take back this location at night with 3,000 men. When he got to this area, though, General James Lane's North Carolinians met him with a blinding sheet of musketry and tore through the dark wooded area and some of those men. Unable to see, the Union soldiers fired into their own men. Both Union and Confederate artillery shells were ripping indiscriminately in all directions. Birney's men panicked. They fell back to Hazel Grove, and their mission was not accomplished. In the morning, they would recall that they had to fight again, but the fight that night before was some of the most vicious fighting that they had. Sergeant Rice Bull of the 123rd New York Volunteers remembered that In the early morning hours of the 3rd, never was there a more beautiful sunrise, and not a cloud in the sky. It was an ideal Sunday morning, warm and fair. It seemed to me like sacrilege that such a sacred day should be used by men to kill and maim each other. Yet kill they did. In 5 hours of fighting, more than 17,500 soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, 1 soldier for every second of combat. It was perhaps the bloodiest morning in American history. Not the bloodiest day, but the bloodiest morning. Here at Chancellorsville. At the location I'm at right now, at Hazel Grove, Lee's artillerists found some of the greatest success they had of the war. When they first got to this place, there was about 4 pieces placed up here on this ridge. And then eventually 6, then 8, then there were 16, and then 30 pieces were placed here. And as these soldiers were ramming home charges and driving them about 1,200 yards out towards Fairview, they were shouting with glee. Black powder in the air. Some of their noses were bleeding. They were deafened by the sounds of the cannons going off around them. But their shot was hitting home. It was doing what it was intended to do. And it was creating devastation ahead, just on the other side of this ridge over here. And off in the direction right there behind me, the Chancellor's house and Fairview is off in this direction here, just to give you an idea where we're at. Here in a minute, I'm going to take you over to another location where the cannons would have seen some of the fighting coming from here too, and you should be able to see the location of the Chancellor house from that spot as well. Real quick battle orientation. I'm at Hazel Grove. Confederate artillery pieces are lining this ridge here because Union soldiers have fallen back from this position towards the Chancellor home and their position that they had on May 3rd. Their new position is off over in this direction towards the Chancellor house, in that U shape that we were talking about on May 3rd. Off in this direction, right over here, Lee is with his men. Stewart is coming up directly from behind here. And so, as you can tell, with the artillery in this position, Lee over in this position, and Stewart where he's at, it makes you understand that you're kind of being surrounded on all sides. And then, I believe at the time, the Union soldiers, especially Hooker, he overestimated the situation. He had the men and the equipment and the ability to defeat his enemy, but it was an overwhelming situation, and it probably made him feel like there might have been more of a force to reckon with, and things just weren't going right. So he fell back, and by May 6th, they were out of there. On the morning of May 3rd, 1863, Union artillery at Fairview suffered the most intense artillery bombardment of the battle. More than 40 Confederate guns at Hazel Grove, which is visible just right over there, opened fire on the 34 guns that were concentrated here at Fairview. After 5 hours of fighting, the Union guns withdrew, and Union infantry slowly fell back into the Chancellorsville clearing, and they left behind stunning carnage. One man, Corporal Rice C. Bull of the 123rd New York Infantry, wrote, "We reached the brow of the hill where our own cannon had been in action. A gruesome sight met our eyes. It was the bodies of nearly 100 horses scattered around the field in the rear of where the artillery had been engaged, all were lying on their backs, with their feet in the air, their bodies swollen enormously. Not alone had men suffered and died. Say hello to the Chancellors. Behind me is the Chancellor Cemetery, and many of the members of the Chancellor family are actually buried in here. During the time of war, a white picket fence surrounded this cemetery. But after the war was over with, or after this battle was over with rather, the picket fence was all but gone, and they decided to build a brick wall around this cemetery. So now, this cemetery does have that brick wall, and many of the members of the family are buried inside. Now, the Chancellors were not broke people. They were extremely wealthy people, and they owned a plantation of roughly 800 acres of land out here, and many slaves, many houses. That's exactly the type of people that they were. So, here they are. You can come visit them if you want to, out here at Chancellorsville Battlefield. And this cemetery is right across the way from where the ruins of the house is. So you see the cemetery behind me here, and if you looked behind me, you can now see across the street where that turnpike is. Right across the street, right over there, is where the ruins of the house is located today. I'm out here in the fields at the Moxley house, which was also a Chancellor house here at Fairview, the place I was just talking about that was being bombarded by the cannons over on Hazel Grove. Now, the post behind me marked the spot of that house. Now, to take you down the path of why this is so important, why this field is so important. This place eventually turned into a field hospital, but 500 men were carried here by Confederate soldiers, roughly 500, and they were laid out here. These were Union soldiers. They were laid in the fields around this house, and surgeons had been working on them on May 5th. But when the Union soldiers lost the battle and moved on, they left their soldiers behind. The Confederates were not going to take care of them because obviously they were pressing the attack. So for more than a week, these men laid out here in these fields with these wounds, life-threatening wounds. Several of them died. A lot of them felt like they needed to die. And because of the bugs and the flies and the dead animals and corpses around them, the gnats were eating them up and causing festering wounds. These men went on and on and on, suffering in pain and agony out here at this house. Until May 12th, when finally, under a flag of truce, the Union Army had wagons come over here and pick these men up, what was left of them, and bring them back to their side so that they could get care. Behind me here are 4 posts that mark the only thing left of the Bullock House, which is basically the foundation or the spot where the house once was. Oscar Bullock lived out here with his family and his wife, Catherine, and in 1860 they had what was a typical farmstead with a modest 2-story home. When the Battle of Chancellorsville broke out, their lives were turned upside down. Their house was destroyed, their fences were torn down and used for fuel, their livestock was stolen and used for the armies, and eventually their fields would be littered with graves of soldiers from both sides of the armies. Oscar would then go on to die in the war, and he would leave behind his children and his wife and leave them with virtually nothing to go on. That's what this war turned out to be for most people. A lot of people died in this war as a consequence of it, and not necessarily died because of battle wounds, but they died from disease and other things that carried them away from home and away from life. Now, directly behind me here is Eli's Ford. On the first onset of the fighting here, a lot of the Union troops came in through this direction towards Chancellorsville, 90,000 soldiers or more. Eventually, on May 3rd, the last line of defense falls back here just behind me. You can see right over my shoulder here, there are earthworks out in those woods right there where the tip of the spear is when the line started to collapse on themselves, and it ended up in almost a V shape for the Federal soldiers out here. It was the last line of defense for Joseph Hooker before he finally decided that they needed to withdraw and pull back across the river from Chancellorsville and cede the ground to the Confederate soldiers out here. And that would spell the end for Hooker at Chancellorsville. Now, as I just talked about earlier about May 3rd, Hooker's men retreats back in this direction, sets up shop, and some of the most vicious fighting in Chancellorsville takes place. Then they start digging these earthworks out here, frantically trying to build something so that they can protect themselves. And they create a U-shape set of earthworks. It was a strong defense that had 100 cannons in it, and they were using things like knapsacks, chopped down trees, and even dead horses and carcasses. If you can imagine sitting inside a set of earthworks like that, where there were dead horses, carcasses, the smell of rotting flesh all around you, gunpowder, smoke, lead, and these men are sitting behind here after a massive defeat and feeling helpless and defenseless, not knowing what was going to happen for the next day. Eventually, on May 5th, Hooker decides it's over. We got to get back across this river. We need to leave the grounds and live to fight another day. So that's what they did. May 6th, even though General Lee knows that he's facing overwhelming odds and he's had a lot of success, but he doesn't know really what's in front of him and what he's going to be facing, he decides to attack these lines. He's going to be aggressive again. He pushes up forward towards these lines, and then he finds that General Hooker has actually evacuated the area, leading to what was arguably the greatest victory of Robert E. Lee's career. Now, they're hard to see today, but the small rise in the dirt over here, you kind of see it dipping down in there. This was the last line of defense for Hooker on May 5th and May 6th. That's all that's left of it. There's not much out there. But this was that U shape that we were talking about earlier in regards to the fighting that took place out here for Chancellorsville. Now, it's hard to imagine today with the traffic flowing around you and everything, and the luxuries of life that we have today. The fight that took place out here, the roar, the sound, the smells, and the fear. But if you get out into a place like this where the trees surround you and you're able to walk around, you can kind of bring it back to life a little bit so that you can experience history from a different perspective and not just from a book. This is really what it's all about, getting out on the trails. So in the end here at Chancellorsville, Hooker reestablishes his line a mile north, and then eventually he falls back across the river. The aftermath of this battle, however, is over 30,000 casualties, 17,000 plus on the Union side, 13,000 for the Confederates. A massive victory for the Confederate Army, and the morale in that Army unit is higher than ever. Going into Gettysburg, Lee has his courage up. He has his hopes high. And he even says, there never was such an army. This army can go anywhere and do anything if properly led. That's what he thinks of this army. And that's what they've been doing up until that point of Gettysburg. Then the Gettysburg campaign takes place and everything changes. That's everything here from Chancellorsville, May 2nd, May 3rd. I hope you enjoyed the video. And click subscribe and like, and keep tuning in. For now, that's History with Waffles, live from Chancellorsville.